Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I'm back from the bizarre San Diego business trip that I teased last week. That turned out to be 36 hours from landing in San Diego to take off for a conference that was really not much of an overlap with my part of the pharma sector. I sort of knew that going in, but it was really highlighted once I got there. Still, I put on, the Gill show for my presentation, and there was one area of affinity that we shared. So I got to kind of riff on that, and I met some neat people, so that was okay. And I flew back with the former FDA commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, who happened to be one row ahead when we boarded. We'd met back when he was first getting nominated in 2017, and anyway, blah, blah, blah. The other thing was I also went for a walk at the end of day 2 before I had to head out to the airport. And I was in the Gaslamp district, and I just figured I'd follow the Maps app and go to this comic store that was somewhat nearby just to get out and do something. There were no bookstores around, so that was as good as it was going to get. But my route wound up taking me through some blocks that were pretty much wall-to-wall homeless encampments, just people in tents lining the sidewalk for entire blocks at a time. And since I was in a suit and felt kind of vulnerable / marked, I actually walked down the middle of the street and avoided cars as they drove by, which was kind of weird of me, but I just figured it was going to be kind of more hazardous for everybody otherwise. Anyway, I was pretty exhausted by the whole trip, which included a 6 a.m. flight to San Diego and a red-eye flight home. So I'm really glad that I recorded this week's show before heading out. I really do need some time to rest, but spring is trade show season, and I've got a FDA meeting to organize and attend in a week, and then a big show in Boston, and a public workshop in Washington the same week in June, and I need to schedule the meeting of my board of trustees, and it all kind of adds up. But the show goes on, And as this week's episode is going to show us, there are narratives to business too. See, my guest this time is John W. Kropf, who is the author of the new book Color Capital of the World: Growing Up with the Legacy of a Crayon Factory. It's from University of Akron Press, and it's this really fascinating exploration of John's hometown, Sandusky, Ohio, and the American crayon company's rise and fall. You see, John's descended from one of the families that founded the company more than 150 years ago, so he brings this semi-insider's perspective to the story, although the firm was already in decline when he came of age. But what he does over the course of the book is tell an American story, one that ties together immigration, innovation, and inventiveness, the Civil War and the post-Civil War world, chemistry, industry, public education, labor, the rapaciousness of finance. There's a lot of things in there that on the surface you'd say, yeah, crayon factory history, what the hell, Gil? But there's, like I say, an American story there. And I wasn't sure what to expect when he reached out about the book. But once I started, I realized he was onto something important with this. It's something that stands in for a lot of this country's history. And this is a brief book. It's only about 130 pages or so. But it's something. John manages in the course of it to interweave stories from the post-Civil War era chemistry experiments that led to the invention of the crayon and the popularization of it, and the development of public schools, education, and beyond, with personal recollections of the crayons and watercolors an American crayon made, and the relationships he had with family members and the ones who lived through some of the growth and decline of the company. And it shows how family fortunes decline and how jobs leave America, especially in the Rust Belt region. And a chunk of the book is about returning to Sandusky and seeing the hulk of the American crayon building as it's getting torn down. It's a really rich history that he covers in this, and the personal side of it is pretty fascinating. And I found the book utterly compelling, to be honest. So go check out Color Capital of the World by John Kropf. It's from University of Akron Press. Now, as caveats go, not a ton on the audio side, but I do want to point out that when we have our little aside about Gordon Lightfoot, that occurred about a week before Gordon's death. I am, as I have stressed in the weekly newsletter, a big Gordon Lightfoot mark, so don't take anything in this episode as remotely disrespectful of the bard from Canada. And in fact, I'm still kind of sad about his loss. Anyway, here's John's bio. John Kropf serves as Global Chief Privacy Officer for a Fortune 500 company. John previously worked as an attorney advisor and policy director for various U.S. government agencies, including the Departments of Justice, State, Homeland Security, and USAID. He also teaches as an adjunct professor at the George Washington University Law School. John has also published a travel adventure book based on his 2 years living in Turkmenistan, Unknown Sands, Travels in the World's Most Isolated Country. His most recent book is Color Capital of the World, Growing Up with the Legacy of a Crayon Factory. He lives in Washington, D.C. area with his wife Eileen, their cat Poppy, and dog Kaya. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with John W. Kropf. So, how did Color Capital of the World shift from family stories you grew up with into, I need to write this book?
Well, Gil, it really started from a very personal place to me. There's a confluence of a couple of factors. I was, number one, sitting at home in Arlington, Virginia, reading my hometown paper. And I was reading about the demolition of the American Crayon Company factory in Sandusky, Ohio. That was the family company where all the color crayons and the color paints were made. And it was kind of like reading about a slow death of a family member. This crayon factory was really kind of the heart and soul of this, medium-sized Rust Belt town in Ohio. And that combined with, I had two losses in my family very close together. Both my mother and my sister passed away, and it brought me back to Sandusky at the same time. They're knocking this old factory down. And so I am thinking, all of these landmarks are disappearing and my family's disappearing. And I felt compelled to somehow preserve those stories, and writing the book was my way of doing it.
And what did you learn in the process? I'll ask separately about, sort of what went into the research of it, but that process of writing this and of bringing your personal story into the history that you were conveying.
Yeah, I learned quite a bit. I mean, I think there's a saying about when you write a book, you have to read a library to do it. I learned both some larger things about that time in history and very, very sort of personal things about connecting the dots in my own family. I think one of the larger things that I learned was this little crayon company that was started was done in the family kitchen. by experimenting in the family kitchen, mixing up different formulas to hit on what was the very first chalk that was used in schools. And the wider connection there was there was a sense of innovation going on especially in the Midwest right after the Civil War that hey, I'm a smart person. I can invent or create almost anything. So you think about the Wright brothers in their garage down in Dayton, bicycle garage, creating the first airplane. Henry Ford is right around the corner in Michigan, learning to create, the assembly line of automobiles. So I learned about this incredible spirit of innovation that was going on at the time, and this family and this factory was part of that time. I also learned, really starting to connect the dots about my family as to what brought some of them out to Ohio was some of the foundations that were laid by some early innovations there, like the very first railroad engine that was west of the Allegheny Mountains was actually in Sandusky, and it brought my great grandfather out to settle his family there because he had come from England and had experience in the Industrial Revolution building locomotive engines. So I'm connecting all these dots, and I'm seeing this bigger picture of innovation and industrialization.
One of the things, the thing I find most fascinating with the book is that confluence of chemistry, industrialization, education, economics, migration, even religion, as there's a Mormon tie-in to one branch of the family and how they end up out there. All those things come together over the course of this book. And I found that absolutely, I would say fascinating along those lines, just to see how much of this is captured, how it all symbolizes in this factory that we now see as a pile of rubble at the beginning of the book. Not a question so much as a, wow, thank you.
No, you're hitting on things. I really learned a lot of other connections as well. For example, there was a big emphasis on education at the time. Ohio was part of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, if I can geek out a little bit on some history.
Definitely, that's what we're here for. Yeah.
But one of the things that the Northwest Ordinance emphasized was that there shall be strongly encouraged, public education for the citizens, and with that, there was then a mandate to build, public schools in every township and every county, and that I was not aware of, and that's what drew one of those threads of the three families out to Sandusky. A man by the name of Marcellus Cowdery was the first superintendent of Sandusky schools, and he was at the time considered very forward-leaning, very innovative. He wanted the most innovative techniques and technology for his schools. And so he turned to his brother-in-law, a man by the name of William Curtis, and said, "You're an inventive guy. What can you do to help me with this?" They basically were using rough-hewn pieces of raw Dover chalk from the cliffs of England. He said, can we solve this problem? And it took off from there, but it was all kind of, I think, set in motion from this emphasis on public education in the Northwest Territory.
Yeah, again, I found that stuff, the way it all ties together and the way none of those pieces work without each of the others being there, and the inherent drive right at the center of it all to make this, not just to invent, but to make a real business out of it and to make something that, could perpetuate for multiple generations and then run into, the American dream gone wrong, I guess, by the end. But
yeah, I mean, there is kind of a old saying, that the first generation invents, the second manages, and then the third kind of spends it all. I'd like to think that this company that had been in my family 4 generations back could have defied that arc, but they didn't for different reasons, which I go into in the book. I was a little kid growing up at the time when it was on the downward slide. And even at the age of 10 or 11, I was so desperate I wanted to be a part of this company, which I thought was kind of magical. I mean, it made crayons.
For God's sake, that's what a kid wants.
And I was just feeling like I have to be part of this. And, but I could even feel at that time, this was, late 60s, early 70s, I could sort of feel things were slipping away even as a little kid.
Now, I will say, I was born 71, northern New Jersey, and it was all Crayola here. So it wasn't American crayon. So, I apologize if we helped hasten,
I won't hold that against you. And I will tell you, I mean, everybody, I'll give an entire library talk. And then somebody will say, well, we'll say more about Crayola. And I'll say, no, this was a different company. I will say, I completely get it. Crayola turned out to be the 800-pound gorilla. They were very good and very successful at the time. But back when the first color crayons were created, 1902 is when we're talking about, is they were frenemies in a way, or rivals. They both had a very similar creation story. Crayola was owned by two families called Binney and Smith, and they actually did admit that, in the archives that I could find, that American Crayon beat them by about 6 months in creating the first color crayons for children. And Crayola went on to win a gold medal, though, at the 1903 World's Fair in St. Louis, because they really, really were good at perfecting this and carrying it through. So they became rivals for many, many decades. And while a lot of kids may not have used the American crayons, they did use often. I'll find the one thing they remember is the Prang watercolor paints that were in those metal tins, the black ones, and you'd snap them open and you'd mix your watercolors in the lid. I think a lot of people remember those.
And, the brand still exists in one way, shape, or form, but yeah.
I mean, Prang is the one brand that did live on from the old American Crayon. Mm-hmm. It's now owned by, there's a series of parent companies that took them over, but it's called Dixon Ticonderoga, which people may know from makers of the number 2 yellow pencil.
Yeah. Which, I in the book, there's you have a figure who refuses to use those, based on the corporate history.
It was an amazing little story. When the factory finally closed, this man had been with them for 50 years, and he said he would never use another Dixon Ticonderoga pencil the rest of his life. So,
how, I don't want to say jarring, but, how different was it for you doing research into that era when lifetime employment actually meant something, when people really did spend 30, 40, 50 years working at a single place, given where we are now and the fact that I looked you up on LinkedIn before this, and, you can look me up. People tend to move around an awful lot as far as employment goes.
I mean, it was pretty extraordinary. I mean, I had always known, the reputation of the company was it was a quote family company, deep ties to the community. But when I started to dig into the research and archives, it was truly amazing. I mean, it wasn't unusual that people worked there 30 years was pretty typical. 40 years, and I mentioned the fellow 50 years, it just kind of blows my mind. And even during the Depression, the management, they were local and they were very connected to these families. I don't think that they laid off a single person. And even when I went on to social media sites to try to branch out in my research, I was trying to find people who might have worked in the factory or their families. And I would get this outpouring of people that would say, my dad worked there, my uncle, my cousins, my brother, my mother. It was a very affectionate outpouring for the company and the ties it had. And I even found these were better than company newsletters. They were almost like booklets that would come out about every quarter. This is in the early part of the 1900s. They were a company, like newsletters on steroids, where they would talk about dinners that they would have for different sections of the factory. They would have a bowling league, a baseball league. They would have holiday dinners, raffles. Everybody got to write different columns. It sounded like a truly extraordinary place to work, but I don't think they were alone. I think there were a lot of these kind of family-oriented companies that were all over, I think certainly Ohio and the Midwest, and they were known to have the longest employer in the county, and at one time the largest. And when it finally closed its doors, it was truly, as I say, it was like watching a family member pass away.
Did any of those relatives or relatives of those workers, upon finding out who you were, hold anything against you? As your family's the ones who finally sold, and or was everybody pretty much, letting things go at this point? Yeah.
I've had near universal praise for it. There was one pretty disgruntled person who vented online. I mean, I figured that was going to be the case. Sooner or later, somebody might not feel so strongly about it or affectionate toward it. But I probably my favorite experience was one of the first book talks I did for it was at the hometown library, Sandusky, Ohio, and I had a full house, and I had a bunch of people in the audience who came up to me afterwards, and one of them was, I think he's one of the union leaders, who said, we worked in that factory and you got mostly everything right. I want to give you a little color on a couple of things that happened.
Yeah.
And I was humbled by that. Just hopefully, and I do say I think in the afterword of the book is, I hope I get this right, because this is not my story. It's the story of all of the families that work there. So I was mindful of that when I was writing it. And I've heard from so many people since I wrote it, I almost feel like I have to do a second edition with all the new little, anecdotes that have surfaced.
But at the same time, you do blend your story into it. It does have a degree of the memoiristic, of the personal, spilling outwards into the family's history and then the community's history. Can you talk a little about both the decision to do that and sort of balancing the balancing act necessary for it?
Yeah. Thanks for calling that out. It was a bit of a risk to do it that way. First of all, I was very grateful to the University of Akron Press. It's an academic press that agreed to take on the book, and they put it into their series on Ohio history and culture. So, I mean, first and foremost, it did have to give a history, and I felt like, yes, I wanted to give the history of the company and sort of a biography of the community, Sandusky, Ohio, and Erie County, Ohio. But it was so personal to me. I wanted to interject what I was going through growing up and connect that to the larger story. So I do toggle back and forth between personal memoir, a company history and then a history of the community. Most people have said they liked the personal part. I felt it was a little bit of a gamble. So I'm glad that the University of Akron took that on and gave me that chance. Probably hasn't worked for everybody. I've seen a couple comments where people said, well, I wish he talked more about the history of crayons. And, I tried to signal in the subtitle that this is a legacy of growing up with a crayon company and not all about crayons.
Yeah, that's the thing. You give enough of the, to me, you give enough of the history of, how the technology came into existence or the chemistry and everything else that went into inventing these and, what was necessary to sort of bring them to kids and bring them to other industrial uses. It's a very different book if you turn into, an ongoing history of the battles between crayon companies and all the other craziness in it. I think you managed to limit it in a way that works really effectively. You also come out pretty harsh on your mom, but I understand that entirely too. So,
yeah, I mean, I know that that's in there. My mother was on that last generation of the one that sort of
spends everything. Yeah.
Not to say I didn't. My mother and I had our piece. We are at one with each other and love each other very much. But it was growing up and witnessing it. I'm writing about kind of how I felt at the time.
Sure.
I suppose. But I will say the great book reviewer Michael Dyrda did get a little review of the book, and I was absolutely just amazed that he picked it up and did a little review of it. He did say the personal doesn't always work with this book, but it's great as a book for nostalgia. So I will take anything Michael Dyrda says.
Trust me, I still have a copy of I actually had somebody in Washington pick up the post, the installment where he had a little squib about my first zine. And that was one of those. I like Michael. We've been pals for a bunch of years, but I really did not expect him to actually write about this in the paper. So yeah, no, I get, even if there's a negative in there, it's Michael Dyrda, for God's sakes.
Yeah, exactly. National treasure. And side note, that's how I learned about your newsletter.
Oh yes, that's right.
Podcast. So
yeah,
that's
it's one of those things where however the word gets out, that's how it does.
Exactly.
But what was the toughest part for you when it came to researching for the book?
Researching the book, I suppose, trying to get enough firsthand accounts from those people that did work in the company. It's hard to track down some of those folks, and I got a handful of people. I got lucky. There was one particular news article by a grandson of somebody who worked in the factory who ended up going to, before the factory was demolished, the demolition and salvage teams allowed some people to go in and salvage. And this one the grandson of the worker who was there got in and was able to take some things with him, paid the salvage company, and then he wrote an article about it. And in the detail of that article, that was kind of a gold mine. But I wish I had had more of those kind of detailed stories. It was really hard to find people that were out there that would be willing to respond to you and then share their stories.
Sure. And had you done much by way of interviews? I mean, you had one previous book that I know of, or at least it's referenced in your bio. Is it the sort of thing you either had to learn or you're pretty much kind of mining, sources that were already out there?
So I was very lucky in that one of my largest sources of information was I'm one of the last descendants of these three families that came together. So I had a lot of company documents and artifacts, and those were a fantastic source of company history. So that was somewhat a blessing for me. I also want to mention one of the other blessings is I came into contact with at least two third cousins who I either didn't know or only had heard their names. And it allowed me to reestablish these family ties. These were women who were descendant from one of the other lines, the Curtis line. And one of them could not have been more gracious. She's in her 80s and had me come to her home for lunch and spent the whole lunch. She pulled out all of her photos and artifacts, and we poured over those together. And I thanked them in the book. So that I was blessed with. And plus I had a few of these crayon artifacts from the factory that were sort of like objects that were embedded with a lot of memory that I could sort of riff off of.
Yeah. Yeah. Talking about that at the end of the book, where you kind of go into the collecting these things and figuring out what you can actually keep in your home versus everything that has to go somewhere. Knowing, my mom is a hoarder significantly. Yeah. So, figuring out what actually, holds enough meaning that you want to pass it along. So, but the one area I was wishing there was more in the book was just the decision to sell the company. I think you have it in 1958. Mm-hmm. When ownership decides to sell to Dixon Crucible, which ends up getting acquired, and there's all the corporate level shenanigans that take place. But what did you learn, I guess, about the, why they decided to sell when they sold, or, well, yeah, what could and couldn't make it in, I suppose.
So a lot of that had, you touched on something that left me with some of the biggest questions in the book, and I was kind of left to speculate. And then after I'd pretty much finished the whole manuscript, I had one theory that one of these third cousins shared with me. And what she said to me was, these lines of families, the three that were in the book, Whitworth, Curtis, and Cowdery, they had she said those lines all died out, meaning they didn't have male descendants. And so it was just like my mother was one from the Whitworth family. They were from the Curtis family. And back in the day of the late 50s, women were never expected to go into business or trained up to do that. And so it's one theory that because there were not any male heirs to take over the reins, they were all the men that were managing it were getting up there in years. And I think they just thought, let's sell this thing, have some security and money for our families to pass down. I would like to think perhaps today it could be a different story, but again, it's just a theory. And a lot of it is, I wonder how much, if they were modernizing enough. Some of the equipment they use in that factory, a lot of it had not even changed since 1902.
Yeah. I mean, you bring that up as part of the reason why ultimately the facility becomes antiquated. Yeah. And within a couple of decades of the sale, things start to fall apart. But yeah, I had wondered, whether it was a CapEx would have been too much, or, we recognize, as far as management or the family went, it just needed to go. But yeah, that's, I've seen enough corporate, transitions, sales, M&A activity, et cetera, that I was just like, oh God, I wish, we had, the letters or some of the conversation that went into that decision. So.
Yeah. I didn't even realize it at the time. I was fascinated with the company as a kid, and, I didn't really learn the intricacies of this later. And, I mentioned in the book, I was so obsessed. I couldn't be part of the company that I'm 12 years old, and I'm pestering my parents night and day for stock certificates because I found out about stock. Like, you know how hard it is to give, 10 shares of stock, common stock to, a 12-year-old kid. It probably cost more than the stock was worth to do it, but they relented. I wore them down so much, but that's when I started to learn about, stocks and ownership by different companies.
It's the plot of a William Gaddis novel, so it's okay. You got that novel J.R. is all about some, I think, 8-year-old who becomes a stock whiz, but
Yeah. So, but I went in the opposite direction. I just kind of felt things were falling apart, and so personally I gravitated toward what I thought would be more security, which is be a lawyer.
Yeah, and a writer. You've managed to write more than one thing. So, in fact, where does that begin for you? The writing life.
Yeah. So when I was 18, I graduated from high school, and I had the stock thing still in my blood. So my parents, God bless them, they arranged for me to go from small town Ohio to New York City. I lived in Manhattan that summer, working as a runner on Wall Street for a second cousin, with a brokerage house. And when I left, my high school girlfriend handed me a blank journal. And I have been writing in journals since I was 18 for that summer in New York. And I had this Walter Mitty fantasy somehow that I could have a secret writing life. It doesn't pay the bills. I've written 2 books. This is the second one. They seem to come out once every 16 years, kind of like the cicadas. And I've had 1 poem published. I've had a number of, actually this book opened some other writing opportunities for me, some essays, and but I keep writing, and I'm just it's part of my life. I have to do it, whether anybody sees it or not.
Mm-hmm. And as far as the decline of the company went, and yeah, I mean, you talk about seeing the very end of it, when the factory is finally being torn down, but that sense of seeing it in decline, and then seeing some of the larger forces like NAFTA and how do we move these things to lower cost labor regions, et cetera. How much of that was I guess conscious for you, in the intervening years? Had you been sort of noticing that, Sandusky's not what it used to be. I don't really go back much, and this is part of the reason things are in decline.
Well, let's see if I hope I'm going to answer your question here. I felt that when I kind of moved away for the last time after college, that Sandusky just didn't hold anything for me as much as I loved growing up there. And I didn't have the perspective or the nostalgia for it until, decades later. And when I did go back to get interested in this, when, I was losing my family, I did meet a city manager who I talked about at the end of the book, who was somewhat inspiring because he was looking at, yes, we need to honor the industrial heritage and innovation, but let's transform into something else, and maybe we can repurpose that heritage for something positive. And so I loved his perspective. He was really looking forward to capitalizing on Sandusky happens to be positioned in a great place right on the Great Lakes they have Lake Erie and Sandusky Bay, and there are islands out there that a lot of cities would love to have that geographic location. And he just had a positive outlook. And the other thing that I'm trying to do is I think about finding a way to honor that legacy through something as simple as getting a state historical plaque. You see those bronze plaques that mark different places. That's the next thing I would like to do, is to have something on the site of the former factory, marking it and letting people remember it, because the landscape is a storehouse of memory for community, and once the landscape is changed, the demolition of the factory, there's that risk that the memory is going to be erased, that people won't remember it. So the book and the plaque, I hope, can keep that alive.
Yeah. I shudder to ask, any thought of ever moving back?
It's not out of the question. I do. So ask me tomorrow. I'll have a different plan on my future. I don't know. But here's what I think is, I love Washington. I've been attracted to it, but I've been here since 1988. It is an expensive and can be highly stressful place to live. And then when I go back to Sandusky to visit, or I go back to my college, which is downstate Ohio in a small college town, I look at the price of the houses and everything else, and I'm thinking, this wouldn't be a bad place to live for many reasons. And I'd have to convince my lovely wife and bride, who is from New England, that would be the place to go. She's grown to appreciate it, but it would have to be the committee would have to negotiate.
Sure. As a lawyer, I'm sure you get all the the intricacies of that.
It does occur to me, and you could have a very nice life there.
Mm-hmm. And you metaphorically managed to bring color to what, as you point out, is a historically gray environment of that whole Lake Erie area. But I could imagine it would be a lot of family conversations to have. But I also did want to give you credit for giving Gordon Lightfoot a shout out in the book when you have the Lake Erie Edmund Fitzgerald anecdote that comes in. I appreciated any credit Gordon Lightfoot gets. I'm always happy. So
Well, the Gordon Lightfoot for the listeners is the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and it might have been a bit of a reach for a book about crayons and paint, but Sandusky and the factory were very much tied to the Great Lakes, and I distinctly remember that November morning, getting dressed to go to school and hearing this tragic news, and then the song really, really has a lot of true resonance with for people that live in that area, because you would know somebody that worked on what they would call a lake boat or a freighter, and they came into Sandusky, they came into the little town next door, Huron, and it was a part of the community, and that song is just never fails to kind of bring the hair on the back of my neck to stand up.
So what's the response been like? You've mentioned doing a couple of events locally there, but what have you been hearing since the book has come out?
Overall, it's been positive. I mean, I will say that you're doing a book is sort of like you have a child. You want everybody to like your child and go out into the world, but you're highly protective, but your child's going to get some bumps and bruises along the way, which I need to accept. I would say I've had the most success with it in Ohio and in the Midwest, which is not surprising, but I'm hoping to branch out a little farther and break out of that. I'm grateful for all of the events I've been doing in Ohio, but I'd like it to be seen as a larger, not so much a regional book, but I like to think, coloring with crayons is a near universal for just about everybody that can remember opening that first box of crayons and getting that crayon high from that waxy smell. I'm hoping to get that appeal going. And I'm starting to get a few events outside of the Midwest region. I've got one Thursday here in Washington, which would be my first event at a bookstore in the mid-Atlantic area. So.
Yeah, I mean, framing the book as, well, again, beyond regional, where you really get it, all that confluence of, I would say, uniquely American factors that take place from the 1800s on through the decline and shutdown ultimately. This book tells a pretty significant story, and one that can be, extrapolated into a lot of, what's happened in America, and even showing what Sandusky becomes. You mentioned how it shifts from taking things that were meant for industrial purposes and shifting them to hospitality, which is great. Yeah. It generates jobs. But, that shift we had overall as a country from, building things into services it's a pretty huge story as these things go. And I think your book does a great job of conveying it in a single company's lifetime. So.
Yeah. And I'm hoping that, there are many of these stories. I realize that I'm just telling one, but I would like to think there's a little bit of magic in the idea of a crayon company versus a company that made
ball bearings,
knives ball bearings or hubcaps. I mean, it's everybody's got this sort of eternal fountain of youth in them when they think of, crayons.
Yeah. Now, in the beginning of the book, you mentioned going on eBay and getting a couple of sets of American Crayon Company. It was 8-packs, I think you were searching for?
The first ones I bought were 8-packs. Yeah.
Oh, first ones. Okay. So you've been continuing. You've been drawing?
I have. I have drawn some, and I actually did a little short video, which I posted, of drawing the title of the book in different colors. I sped it up, so it was maybe a minute and a half of drawing the title of the book.
And, when your kid was growing up, were you kind of insistent about crayons and creativity?
I wasn't insistent about crayons. I really was sort of standing back and marveling at, well, what is she going to gravitate toward? And yeah, she did use crayons. And I was just happy to see that they're still around and they're still popular. And I still, at any book event or library event, I will still, if somebody brings their kid, I want to ask him, hey, do you draw with crayons? Because I'm doing a informal poll here. I want to make sure that they're still in use. It's not something that is just nostalgia, but I think the overall answer is I'm getting is yes. There tends to be, it sounds like a lot of them are moving toward colored markers, but crayons are still out there in force.
Yeah, I never know. I've got nieces who were, well, now they're 12 years old and older, but I got no idea if everybody's just, drawing on iPads or whatever, or if there's still that physical manual thing that we do when we're at play,
Yeah. And part of when I open the book, what I talk about is basically immersing myself. We had so many crayons in our house that, I would basically not only draw on the paper, I would draw on my skin, my arms, my face. And then I did an experiment where I took my two favorite colors, blue and green, and then I had to see if they tasted differently. So I took a bite out of each. And the results of the experiment were they tasted the same. So I don't know if kids are still into it that much. I was.
And even in the book where you bring up how they had to come up with non-toxic formulations, knowing, even back then, knowing that little kids are going to try and eat whatever you hand them.
And the other thing I love, they were little things you don't think of. They designed hexagonal crayons for little kids because it would keep them from rolling off the table. Just little stuff like that. And the packaging was just wonderful. They would hire well-known children's illustrators to design these beautiful packages with frameable artwork. I mean, you don't see that anymore today. It's just a different kind of a market. But I collect some of these almost for the packages. I actually do a little blog that I feature different themes every so often.
Mm-hmm. So you see another book in your future?
If there is, I'll answer the question, but I sort of said I'm giving myself a year just to be single-minded about getting this story out here.
Sure.
But I can't help but think of family stories. I think for me, that's where I get most of my material. If I were to do another one, I have on my father's side, my grandfather was a spherical balloon pilot in World War One. He's one of these guys that would go up in literally a wicker basket about 5,000 feet up, and they would have a telephone line cable down, and they would look down on the enemy lines and give positions as to where the Germans were in, Western Front in France, and then they'd get shot down, a few times, a dozen times or so, and this is in the days when parachutes were still fairly experimental, and he survived. But I have his journal from that period that he kept, and I keep thinking there's probably a story there.
I can imagine. That's well, it's a different world. It's something that really highlights, and this is just the uniquely personal aspect of getting stuck talking to me. You've got a lengthy family history in America. I'm first generation American. I've got family spread all over the planet, and a lot of whom got wiped out in the war and everything else. Mm. I don't want to say what's it like, but do you feel, I would say, a sense of either responsibility or duty, I suppose, in having such long roots here in America in terms of understanding your family and what they did and what they built? Because this book seems like a tribute to all that, but I never know whether that's really meaningful to people who do have that history, given that I'm the first generation born in America for our family. So.
I feel, Gil, extremely privileged and extremely lucky to have access to some of that story. I was lucky in that I had a grandmother who was an amateur genealogist and kept wonderful stories and records, which helped immensely with the book. And it just makes you realize how grateful you are for all of these people that sacrificed and went into here you are here and now, able to live a relatively comfortable life. And I find myself wanting to do some other things. I'm trying to join different organizations to give back and do a lot of volunteer work. I also have to say I really enjoy. I don't know if you watched the show Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr., but I
heard about it, but I haven't watched it. So.
It's a PBS show where he'll take, usually it's a celebrity or semi-famous person and who doesn't know their family roots story, and he has a team of genealogists and even DNA samples that he takes, and it's wonderful how he tells their stories. And I keep thinking, I would love it if everybody could know their story, because it really, I don't know, it gives you a sense of perspective and a feeling of humility.
Yeah.
Is all I can say.
Yeah,
and
I
bet you would love to find your story and hopefully maybe there's a way to do that in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned by the end of the book, the question of whether your next generation, whether your daughter's going to have that same interest or how she's going to respond to past and future in that respect. Since nobody's listening, what's her?
A couple people will.
I'm sure. I joke, but yeah, what's her understanding of this, or how do you see her reaction to the work you've put into this and what your family history really means? What does it mean to her, I suppose?
So, there's sort of a phenomenon where you think your kids aren't listening to you. You tell them all these stories and you're thinking, it probably doesn't mean anything to them. They'll never remember. And then every so often she'll come out with a statement of some story I told her. And she'll say, well, didn't grandma do this or that? And I'm thinking,
You were
my heart
listening?
swells. Like, you remembered, it's like, yes. So somewhere in there, this isn't the age where she's in her early 20s. She's not going to be sitting around with a dusty old genealogy books and contemplating this stuff. But if I can plant a seed in her, I'll feel like I apologize.
No worry, you're a busy man. It's okay.
Yeah. If I can plant a seed in her that she carries on, I mean, that would be wonderful. She gave me a book a few Christmases ago about, it was one of these template books where it asks family questions and you fill out the answers to them and then you give it to your child. Well, I basically said, honey, this is my book already written for you. So here you go.
Nice. Again, my mother keeps a huge genealogy and over the years really kept a lot about the scatteredness of our family and who we lost and where things went. And it's just so different than to see this sort of structure that you have as you can look back and see the tree, see the things that they built and being allowed to stay there as opposed to being, rounded up and put into camps, which, is a separate thing entirely for us. But my dad's side, he doesn't look anything beyond his own father and never showed that interest and never brought that sense of, family and history to us. So, seeing someone devoted like this who can not just tell the family story, but, show what it means in parallel with America, I think it's a pretty amazing accomplishment. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Like I say, I really want to honor it and tell all these other stories that are connected to it. The people in the factory
that's the other thing. Yeah. You're not just championing ownership and management. You really do bring those individuals, the people who work there and their kids and all those stories in. So that sense of community also is God damn it. You made a really good book out of all this, John. I'm pretty impressed.
I hope so. I mean, it like I say, I care most about what the community thinks of it. And if they're okay with it, then I feel like, all right, I passed the test.
So last question, because you're a listener of the show, this is coming. Who are you reading?
Wow. I probably have one of the most eclectic reading habits of anybody. I've got about 5 books going. I'm reading a book, if you go all the way back to Walter Lord, who wrote about the sinking of the Titanic. I'm reading a book he wrote called Dawn's Really Light, about the War of 1812 and the burning of Washington. Mm-hmm. The other extreme, I'm reading a book that an old high school friend gave me. It's a very spiritual book mm-hmm. called Invisible Acts of Power. I don't normally read books like that, but I force myself to read widely. You're an inspiration, certainly in that direction. I do read, left to my own devices. I like to read a lot of history and memoir, especially. There's a lot of Midwestern memoir that I like. There's a fellow by the name of David Giffels, who is actually on the faculty at the University of Akron, who wrote a number of memoirs. It kind of inspired me a bit.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you had sort of models for the writing in here. I should have asked you that earlier, but is he one of the?
I mean, sort of somebody to inspire you is, again, this writer David Giffels, who he wrote a book called The Hard Way on Purpose, and it's about growing up in Akron, Ohio, rubber capital of the world, and how he lived through the entire downturn and stayed there while everybody left, and what that was like and how people survived and, come through the other end, whenever that is.
Yeah.
And so that was somewhat inspirational, and I enjoy his writing immensely.
And besides those, anything else? You do mention about 5 things that are piled up on your reading list.
I'm obsessed with the idea of time and memory. I'm reading a book it's a translation of a French author about the internet and memory.
I know what you're talking about. New York Review of Books
Yeah, exactly. It's a series
The
of sort of
fragmentation of memory, something like that.
Exactly. So I am I'm reading that one, and I actually keep a separate notebook on just thoughts I have about time and memory because it's almost an obsession.
Maël Renoir, Fragments of an Infinite Memory. That's
You're good, but I should
no, that's one that even I was like, I should know this, but it's an infinite memory, so we're never going to get around to it. So.
Yeah, exactly. But the French take on things is always got to have that. I know it's going to be different.
Yeah.
And then let's see. I'm reading. I've been working on. It's a Russian novelist. Is it Gogol's The Dead Souls?
Yeah.
That's a challenging book. I'm halfway through it. I have to put it down and pick it up. So
I've got it on my shelf, but I've never tried. I'll have to admit it.
I have a list of books that I've failed on, and it's not in that pile yet, but it's a challenge.
It's one of those.
I like to get in a little bit of poetry.
Yeah.
Billy Collins had a new book out of poetry, or newish. Elephant was in the title, I believe. I don't remember. No, Whale was in the title, not Elephant. I'm terrible with.
Yeah, I'm searching quickly. Whale Day and other poems.
Whale Day. Yeah. I've seen him read before, and I do love his poetry. It's accessible. It's not too obtuse that I can relate to it.
Well, if I ever write any more haiku for business travelers, I'll be sure to keep you on the mailing list for that.
Yes, please. It's. Books are life. It makes life interesting.
Yeah. That's why I spend my Sundays and other times doing this stuff. So, John, thanks so much for coming on the show, and thank you for the book and for following up about it, because as you can tell from what I do, things can easily fall through the cracks. So, or they can roll over and fall off the table. So I'm glad you made the book hexagonal too.
Well, yeah. And I'm going to apologize to your listeners. I just never was able to suppress my email pings, but Gil, I want to thank you immensely, because I know you're a busy man. I just am amazed at the number of books that you do and talk about, and to be included is an honor. And I truly mean that. So
thanks so much, John. And that was John W. Kropf. His new book is Color Capital of the World, Growing Up with the Legacy of a Crayon Company, from University of Akron Press. I hope I got across some of what makes this book special and why it's such an interesting American story to tell. And I'm awfully glad the show has opened me up to things like this that would be outside my regular, go read and reread some of your faves, Gil. In this case, John connected with me because he saw the Washington Post blurb or squib about my haiku for business travelers zine a couple of years ago, and discovered the podcast, got in touch, had the book come out, etc. So I just love the way these interconnections happen, Now, John's on Twitter as J Kropf, JKROPF, and on Instagram as John.Kropf, with Kropf spelled the same way. He's got an old school blog at compulsively-aimless.blogspot.com. I have to give him credit, A, for keeping up a blog, B, for having one of those URLs that's impossible to spell. I will have links to all of this stuff in the show and episode notes for this one, along with the links for the order page for Color Capital of the World. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast that comes out every week with really interesting conversations with some pretty fascinating people, writers, artists, cartoonists, etc. You can also support the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie, TV show, book, music, piece of theater, art exhibition, or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a letter, postcard, I love postcards, email, DM, or by leaving me a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973 869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that, you'll get cut off. Just call back and leave another message. And let me know if it's okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might say something interesting that would be great for the listeners to hear, but I would never do that without the speaker's permission. If you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. My day job treats me just fine, and my expenses are pretty minimal for the show. So I do hope you'll support individuals or institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, and other crowdfunding platforms where there are people who need help with medical bills, rent, veterinary bills, getting artistic projects off the ground, or other needs. If you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank every month. I make occasional contributions to the Poor People's Campaign and Freedom Funds. I make donations to political candidates because of my job as a lobbyist. But there are a lot of things you can do you can do with your money to try to help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.